Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CSSS is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. And this program is part of that effort. Now, that the salience of world's nuclear arsenals is on the rise. Developing nuclear weapon states are funding massive modernization programs, and nuclear weapons are becoming more prominent in military strategies and also rhetoric, which seems to be the reference to what President Vladimir Putin has been saying during the Russo-Ukraine war. The gradual post-Cold War period of reductions in nuclear stockpiles is clearly over. And we're now sliding back into nuclear competition and, in some cases, arms race between nuclear dyads. Ironically, this flies in the face of promises made by many nuclear-armed states to reduce nuclear risks and seek a world without nuclear weapons. The report says that while overall the number of nuclear warheads continues to decline, this is only due to the United States and Russia dismantling and retiring warheads. Now, global reductions of operational warheads appear to have stalled, and their numbers are rising again. The United States and Russia, which together possess almost 90% of all nuclear weapons, have extensive programs underway to replace and modernize their nuclear warheads, their missile, aircraft, and submarine delivery systems, and their nuclear weapon production facilities. Now, China is also modernizing and expanding its program, aiming to catch up with the US and Russia. Ditto for India, which is modernizing and expanding its triad and whose doctrine is undergoing changes. India is also investing in ballistic and cruise missile defense technology systems while working towards MERS, which is a difficult way of saying that, you've got these ballistic missiles with multiple warheads that can independently strike targets on the ground. It is also increasing the range of some of its missiles, which brings Pakistan into the picture, which is also playing catch up because even as India invokes China as the reason for taking certain steps, the bulk of its forces and fighting echelons are still targeted towards Pakistan. Now, before I get to this discussion, on a personal note, which is of course not part of this discussion, but which I consider is the only conversation worth having, these developments and conflicts across the globe are happening at a time when the planet has already hit the climate iceberg. None of this will matter in a few decades, but until then, it's probably instructive to discuss whether we'll destroy ourselves through nukes, whether to emerging tech, or whether climate will bring about the sixth extinction. So let me introduce my guest. I have with me Dr. Manpreet Sethi. Dr. Sethi is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi and heads its program on nuclear issues. She is also senior research advisor, Asia Pacific Leadership Network. With her is Matt Korda, who's Associate Director for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, and an Associate Researcher with the WMD program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is SIPRI. He co-authors the nuclear weapons chapters for the annual SIPRI yearbook. Last but not least is Dr. Adil Sultan. Dr. Sultan is a former Air Commodore and currently Dean Faculty of Aerospace and Strategic Studies at Air University. He also served at the Strategic Plans Division for 14 years, where he dealt with arms control and non-proliferation. So, Matt, let me begin with you to give us a general sense of the report. But when I was prepping for this program, I thought of Salvador de Madariaga, who is, a Spanish diplomat and writer, and also once chairman of the League of Nations Disarmament Commission. He said something very interesting about the direction of causality in disarmament efforts. And he said the trouble with disarmament was and still is that the problem of war is tackled upside down and at the wrong end. Nations don't distrust each other because they're armed because they distrust each other. So the salience of weapon systems and platforms will obviously increase with deteriorating international security environment. So I'm assuming that report, obviously, because the other chapters also will be focusing on the one that you have written, is written in the backdrop of deteriorating situation, increasing distrust, and the rest of it.
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. This is fantastic to join such a distinguished panel. So I guess just to sort of hit on a few things that you mentioned there, you rightly bring up that our report talks about how the global number of nuclear weapons in the world is changing, right? So, if you were to take a very intense focus on the numbers specifically, you would see a few trends, right? You would see that the global inventory of nuclear weapons is decreasing, right? Just very gradually. But that is not because of a particularly positive trend in the world of nuclear weapons. This is, as you say, because the United States and Russia are dismantling these old retired warheads. That is kind of where the good news ends from a disarmament perspective. Instead, what we're seeing is that nearly all nuclear-armed states, well, certainly all nuclear-armed states are modernizing their arsenals, meaning that they are replacing older systems with newer ones, and in many cases, improving either the weapons qualitatively or quantitatively. In terms of the quantitative increases, we are seeing that several nuclear-armed states are actually expanding their arsenals. So China, Russia, very likely, North Korea, likely India and Pakistan, and recently the UK has joined that group, right?
Yeah,
we haven't sort of counted a material increase yet in this most recent edition of the yearbook, but clearly the aspiration in the UK, based on their recent statements, is that they want to give themselves more flexibility when it comes to deploying a larger arsenal. Similarly, in the United States, where I'm based right now, the conversation is very much moving towards an increased deployed arsenal. We have not yet seen that, but clearly if you take a look at the statements that we're seeing, from officials that would, or academics, think tank folks who would presumptively enter in on a Trump administration. We're seeing from the Strategic Posture Commission, which is not a official U.S. policy document, but sort of adjacent to U.S. policy. They are clearly advocating for an expanded nuclear arsenal in some capacity, right? So the trend is very much moving in
just a quick intervention here, Matt. It is, it seems to me that this is also because of where relations have gone between the United States and Russia, and also the fact that the bilateral arms control, regime has all but unraveled because, was it Feb last year when Russia suspended its participation in New START? I think that was the last remaining treaty between the US and Russia. So I just want you to, because you are talking about that, maybe you could touch upon that also.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important to note that, as you say, all of these changes with the numbers and trends, all of this is taking place in the context of significantly enhanced geopolitical competition, right? Which all sides are embracing at this point, right? This great power competition that we're seeing. And additionally, the additional context that you've pointed out is that we are seeing basically the death of arms control in real time, at least for the foreseeable immediate future, right? I'm hesitant to say that arms control is dead as a concept because you can't kill it like it's just a tool, right? But the tool becomes relevant when policy windows open or close, and right now it seems like the window is really closed, right? So we're seeing that countries that previously, were able to sit down at a table with each other, even if they were ideologically opposed to doing so, now they can't seem to do that, right? There's much more of like a blaming and shaming aspect to arms control. And it's very difficult for me to imagine that any nuclear armed state would be interested in sitting down at a table and seriously talking about capping their own nuclear arsenals in the immediate future. So all of this is happening. All these numbers are changing in that context. And one other thing I just want to point out as well is that not only are the modernization happening, the arms control is dying, all these things, but also transparency around nuclear weapons is really, really decreasing, right? So this report is all used, we use open sources and satellite imagery to compile this report, but whenever possible, we like to rely on official sources to the extent that they're out there. And what we're seeing is that there have always been certain countries that have always been quite opaque with regards to their nuclear forces. Like Israel is a great example. They don't even acknowledge their nuclear forces. But the United States used to be very transparent. It is absolutely decreasing its transparency. We are seeing instances where there will be reports that come out, we write about them, and then the next year's report comes out and those details get scrubbed, right? So we're seeing that happening in the United States. The UK, exactly the same thing is happening, right? So countries that used to be more transparent are starting to go down as well with that regard.
And the ones that are, developing have already been opaque, and that opaqueness is going to continue. Dr. Manpreet, Sethi, so before we get to India-Pakistan in the latter half, I also want to get your take on the overall global situation, security situation, and the salience, the increasing salience of nuclear weapons. It seems to me that the Madriaga's direction of causality is absolutely right. I mean, increasingly so, because there's so much of distrust now between nuclear dyads. We'll talk about that. One of the dyads, which is India-Pakistan, disengagement and not really any channels open for, talking about things where we need bilateral cooperation, whether it's nuclear risk reduction, whether it's climate. We were just before the program talking about the fact that Delhi hit 52.3 Celsius. So it's not something that any one state can do. Obviously, you need regional and international cooperation for that. So I want you to give me your perspective on how you perceive the global security scene, and then I'll get to Adil Sultan.
Thank you very much, Ejaz, and thank you for having me on the program. I think it's very right that you are first talking about the global nuclear dynamics, which seems to be in a rather gloomy situation right now. And that's exactly what is reflected in the chapter that Matt has written in the SIPRI yearbook. I think if you look at the global picture today, the salience of nuclear weapons has not been as high as this since the end of the Cold War. So during the Cold War, we used to talk about the possibility of nuclear use, but we seem to be living in that time once again. With the nuclear dyads, with 9 nuclear countries, nuclear-armed countries today, none of the dyads is actually talking to each other. So the level of mistrust and therefore the dangers of misperception, because it's natural when you're not talking to each other, you are making worst-case assumptions about what the other side is doing. And that
with the possible exception of the Russia, North Korea, China triad. So
yeah.
Possibly, I'm not sure. But yeah.
They are not adversarial dyads. All of the adversarial dyads are not talking to each other, and as I said, making worst case assumptions about what the other side is doing. As you listed out a lot of things that you are thinking that India is doing, which it isn't, but that's the perception that's going out, because we are not talking about these things. And as Matt said, transparency is really not the hallmark of nuclear sort of capabilities worldwide, and certainly not in our region. So certainly from the time when we used to think of South Asia as the nuclear flashpoint, all of us have lived through that phase where, the West used to talk about how this is where the dangers lie. We've reached a situation where the global nuclear dynamics today is of an extremely dangerous sort. And I would say it's not just the breakdown of arms control architecture as we have known, but it's also the use of language, which has become far more loose when we talk about nuclear weapons. Earlier there was a certain amount of reverence with nuclear weapons because you thought of them in a separate category. Today you seem to be talking about them in a rather more casual manner, and that is also affecting the environment.
I would even say more than casual, it's also cavalier kind of attitude towards nuclear weapons. And previously one was kind of circumspect, possibly because of the taboo, on the possible use of such thing. I think that seems to have kind of also unraveled.
Yeah, the biggest concern is that the strength of the norm of non-use, or the taboo, as you said, could be eroding because of this cavalier attitude that we are bringing into the possibility of use of nuclear weapons. So all of this nuclear cacophony, as I call it, in the atmosphere matters. And frankly, I mean, surprisingly, we will talk about India, Pakistan. They seem to be showing the greatest amount of maturity at this moment in terms of, handling the relationship than we are seeing in some of the other nuclear armed states.
Right. So, follow up. So, is this a situation that you think is likely to further deteriorate, or is there space for sort of rebuilding the bilateral and multilateral arms control architecture? Where do you think it's likely to go?
So I am extremely hopeful that it will not go in the direction in which it turns absolutely negative, that there will be some statesman-like leaders who will be able to arrest the slide that we seem to be in. I don't see arms control of the old type being revived once again. I think we will have to rethink how and reimagine what arms control is going to look like. How do we even want to call it? Because it won't be with the kind of parity that existed between US, USSR, and therefore the bean counting approach, ceilings on capabilities, etc. We might have to think about how we are going to do risk reduction rather than arms control for the foreseeable future. And I hope that will happen before a crisis of any kind strikes us, because it should not happen that we wake up only after a nuclear crisis.
Absolutely. When you talked about statesmen, I silently chuckled because I was reminded of the first presidential debate between President Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And I'm not sure if either of them, one because of the age and one because of compulsive lying, is going to act as a statesman. Matt, no offense meant to the Americans. We also have very have very bad leaders in the global south, so it's overall, I think
that's okay. I'm not American. I only live here, so
okay, then that's fine. Gee, Adil Sultan, give me your overview of where the global situation is, and then we're going to shift gears and go to India, Pakistan dialogue.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Ejaz, for making an effort that I could eventually join. On a lighter side, what Manpreet said, at this juncture, India and Pakistan are probably showing more maturity. So I was just thinking maybe we can lead the arms control initiatives from South Asia and set some examples for the others. But largely, I agree with what Manpreet and Matt was saying. But we have to see this, that arms control was never de-linked with the political situation or the global political environment or the domestic politics. At this moment, there's so many crises around the world that most of the major powers that had been championing or leading the arms control, they are embroiled in their own domestic crisis either, or they are engaged abroad with other countries. So I think there's lack of focus. There's too much on the plate, and there's too little for arms control community or people who used to advocate the arms control. That's why the focus is probably less. And like you rightly said, there are many other existential challenges as well. The way we used to see nuclear use as one of the serious existential challenge, but there are some things like climate change is in our face. Nuclear is something, it may be used, but like you said earlier, the climate change is a very upfront challenge that probably we have to deal with that. So I see this linked with what is happening all around the world, where so many crises, and also the United States, which has been traditionally leading. You see Obama legacy, the kind of arms control initiative that were pushed by him, that came from his vision that moving towards world free of nuclear weapons, but we don't see that leadership now. So the absence of leadership, that the crisis, domestic and external, all around, I think these all issues combined together has reduced the salience or this focus on nuclear arms control.
Right. Matt, you want to say something with reference to what Manpreet or Adil has said?
Yeah, absolutely. There were a few notes that I was just jotting down here.
Okay.
In particular on the topic of the sort of the what Manpreet mentioned about like the 9 nuclear armed states right now, right? So we are in a very different situation than the Cold War, right? When you had, largely this big superpower dyad between 2 countries. Right now you have 9 countries, which means you have 9 nuclear armed decision makers. And this, I think, does raise some questions, right? As you point out as well, with regards to the debate, right? Like it's a, in jest, but it's also very important, right? Which is, deterrence in some measure relies on the idea that decision makers are going to act rationally in the context of a nuclear crisis. 9 nuclear armed decision makers means 9 sets of emotions. It introduces a lot of new advisors and instincts and biases and things like that into the decision-making spectrum. And there are, I think, a lot of very reasonable questions that people are asking right now about, okay, we have 9 nuclear-armed decision-making chains, and are all 9 of these chains going to act rationally in the context of a crisis? I personally don't think so. And you can see that with, the second point I wanted to raise, which is, Manpreet, you mentioned this note about nuclear language, right? This signaling that we're seeing, and we are seeing so much more of it, right, than we've seen over the past several decades. And they all take several forms, right? So some of these are overt threats, but many of them are almost like reminders, right? They are reminders to the world, hey, we are a country that has nuclear weapons, don't mess with us. But of course, everyone already knows that they have nuclear weapons. So you have to wonder, like, okay, what are these reminders, right? When they're coming from Russia or North Korea or, some of these other countries, what are they meant to signal? And I guess there are questions that sort of come up for me, which is, okay, if these are, if they're meant to communicate something very specific to adversaries or competitors, I'm not certain that countries are actually understanding each other's signals. And so I certainly, like, that worries me just in the context of a crisis, but also in an arms race, because when you have not very much transparency, countries are going to always assume the worst of each other. And so, whenever you have countries that are trying to remind each other that they have nuclear weapons, other countries are going to interpret that poorly and respond accordingly.
One of the things that I feel before I go to Manpreet and we start talking about India and Pakistan, North Korea considers the United States a threat. And I've often felt that, when you put yourself in someone else's shoes, and I remember talking to a couple of American friends, part of the Beltway crowd, and I said, well, you talk about Iran, which is fine, but how about you look at the United States from Tehran's perspective, and then see how and why some of these things are unfolding. I mean, ditto for North Korea. Now, in the case of Russia, for instance, notwithstanding Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the fact that the entire West is supporting Ukraine is something that's probably pushing the Russians towards kind of talking about, we're going to put the TAC nukes on the soil of Belarus, or we are going to do a TAC nuke exercise. That's my sense. But Dan Smith also has a chapter in this yearbook, and it's on international stability and human security. And we're talking about this. There's a nexus between instability and insecurity and what we are discussing right now, and it clearly indicates that global security has deteriorated. You've got 2 major conflicts, Russo-Ukraine war, Hamas-Israel war, then at least 50 active conflicts across the globe. And then you have deteriorating Sino-US relations, and then broader geopolitical tensions have continued to affect the political consensus on managing armed conflicts. So estimated global military expenditure has risen for the 9th consecutive year in 2003, and it's now surpassed $2.4 trillion. It's also in 2023 primarily driven by the Russia-Ukraine war. This was just to sort of give a perspective on what kind of ecosystem, global ecosystem it is in which things are happening. Now, Manpreet, I want you to give me your impression, since you are obviously, you work in this area, you clued in. Give me your sense of what you think of Matt's chapter on India's nuclear forces.
So first of all, as I was saying, Matt is the person who discloses to us what the numbers of India's nuclear forces are, or Pakistan's, and China, because none of the three countries actually say anything about nuclear numbers. So obviously, Matt, you have some sophisticated way of understanding why you are reaching as precise a number as 172 that you've given for India this time. I think my understanding is that after 25 years of having nuclear weapons, both India and Pakistan, irrespective of the numbers, we certainly seem to have arrived at robust, secure second strike capabilities. I think there is an understanding that there is a mutual vulnerability. Neither of the two sides can actually use what is known as a splendid first strike to disarm or to decapitate the other side of its nuclear capability. So to that extent, I think the stability that comes with the presence of nuclear weapons, to some extent, because of mutual vulnerability, can be seen to be there. Also, as Matt has mentioned in his chapter, the capabilities are also increasing. So it's not just about warhead numbers; it's about increasing capabilities as well, which you can see in in the context of India in its missile developments. So whether it's the focus is essentially on survivability, so whether it's mobility of the missiles, including with canisterization, whether it is through penetrability with our MIRV missiles now, all of those are some of the dimensions in which India is moving. And I would say the primary factor in this, which perhaps Matt has not, if you would allow me to critique, put too much attention to, is that India is working according to the doctrine that it gave itself in 1999. The draft nuclear doctrine, and then a part of that got replicated in the 2003 doctrine. India hasn't veered from that. So at that time, the doctrine had stated that India wants to build an effective, survivable, flexible response within the parameter of credible minimum deterrence. And when the Indo-US nuclear deal was signed, there were several people who suggested that now that you have access to imported uranium, the indigenous uranium will go into building stockpile, which hasn't happened. We are 15 years into the nuclear deal today. So the doctrine which sort of gave the philosophy of minimum deterrence, you build your credibility. So you are looking at what the developments on the other side. And if there was a credible missile defense, perhaps the numbers would need to go up to cause unacceptable damage. But essentially, the point I wanted to make was that India is still sticking to the doctrine that it gave itself, and the capability build-up that you are seeing in terms of the triad is something that was mentioned in the doctrine, that India would build a triad. So the coming in of the SSBNs or the long-range missiles, land-based, is not something that's come out, out of the blue. It was stated then. Capability takes time to build, and that's what we are seeing happen over these 25 years as we are maturing technologically, as well as in our understanding of what nuclear deterrence is.
So a very quick question before I go to the other one. So Vipin Narang has also written about this, as Ashley tells us, about India kind of moving from no first use, which is a political declaratory policy, and might not have any operational significance. Ashley has even gone to the extent of saying that perhaps in order to catch up with China, India might have to do hot tests, as he mentioned in his book, and he was interviewed also about this. So now I'm not saying that what he's saying is India's policy, but what I'm saying is that he's a very influential Indian American thinker. He was also deeply involved in this civil nuclear deal when he was advising Ambassador Blackwell. So he is someone who has been on the inside. So I just want to get your sense on the kind of movement sort of away from the NFU declaration to the possibility of an actual operational first use of nuclear weapons?
So, and I have written a lot about this to suggest that there is a military logic of no first use. There's no reason why India would feel the need to move away from no first use. All these arguments that you make by different people who have suggested are just suggestions. I mean, they are picking up something from somewhere and making this point about India moving away. Where has India moved away? I mean, if you look at the focus of our capability,
for instance, statements that India will retaliate through nuclear weapons in case of a biologic chem bio attack is obviously something that kind of dilutes the declaration of not using nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states, and also obviously then kind of dilutes the NFU. I mean, I'm just trying to understand the perspective that you're bringing to this discussion.
Yeah, so the point that you made about chemical and biological weapons and India suggesting that you could do nuclear use against that, I think that came in as part of the US nuclear posture review after 9/11. So the threat about non-state actor use of chemical and biological, and since India was bringing out its nuclear doctrine at that time, this got mirrored into it. And since we don't revise, unlike the US, which has given up that idea, the nuclear posture review that gets revised every now and then, the Indian nuclear doctrine doesn't. We do have that as part of the doctrine. But I think the role of the nuclear weapon is essentially seen to be only to deter nuclear weapons as being the only credible role. There are lots of question marks that one can raise about how you would do nuclear deterrence for chemical and biological. But the essential point that I want to make is, yes, it's a declaratory statement when India says it's no first use, but the seriousness of commitment of India's no first use is evident in its capability build-up. And if you see that, there is no focus on building large numbers or very accurate missiles, or missile defense as damage limitation. Missile defense is being wedded to the idea of no first use with only area or point defense. So that seriousness is visible in the kind of capability that India is building, with the understanding that this is a weapon of mass destruction. It's best suited for deterrence by punishment, and that it's a political tool. So the use of the nuclear weapon is really the end of the story. And I don't think that is how India is signaling the deterrence to the other side.
Right. So I'm going to do a little mischief, because I was going to ask you another question. But instead, I'm going to take that question to Adil to get the Pakistani perspective, and then get Matt to say something about what's been said and circle back to you. So, Adil, Manpreet has talked about the stability of the Indian nuclear thinking, and that the entire development, technological and modernization, is in keeping with the 1999 draft doctrine, and then later 2003, I think. And of course, the fact that India is wedded to NFU and looks at the arsenal as a deterrent. Now, my issue is that India has also developed, and now I'm not focusing on nuclear weapons, I'm talking about the strategic operational approach vis-a-vis Pakistan, that there is a small band within which India can use conventional capabilities to punish Pakistan. Whether it is because it assumes that Pakistan has sponsored some attack inside India, or any other provocation which gets to a point where it feels that it needs to punish Pakistan. So we have like the so-called 2016 surgical strikes, and then of course the 2019 episode in Balakot, and then now my issue is, and I've written about this, that the assumption is that the opening round India will win and draw blood, and therefore the onus for going up the escalation ladder will be on Pakistan, right? Now, in Feb 2019, because we're talking about a particular point of conflict where force was concentrated, Pakistan basically won that round. Okay, now the moment that happened, the call from then NSA and current NSA, also Indian NSA, Mr. Dovul, was what was referred to by Prime Minister Modi also as Qatal ki Raaz. It's like, that we're going to fire missiles. And Pakistan's response was that there's going to be a quid pro quo plus. Now, missilery between a nuclear dyad is a big no, because you have no idea whether the missile contains a strategic warhead or a tactical warhead. And so you can either end up failing deadly or failing impotent. So my point is that despite the stability at the higher order of things, at the lower order, there is increasing instability. And that could then lead to a spiral. Now you understand my mischief, because I was going to put it to Manpreet, but I put it to you, and I'll go back to all this.
No, you have already, I think, done what I would have said. You have explained it well. Okay, this, in terms of strategy, the stability, instability, or space below strategic threshold. These concepts have been tested during Cold War, and India, Pakistan, definitely we learned from the Cold War dynamics, and we try to replicate those thinking, that strategic thinking in South Asia. We have done this. In nuclear, I think one important factor is the credibility of a state which is threatening to use nuclear weapon. And I don't want to go into details. So once you talk about credibility, there are several factors. It talks about leadership also, the capability, and all those things. So I think it's situational, it's contextual. In 2019, yes, India thought that there is a space, because if you go before 2019, if we see as we perceive from Pakistan, India's strategic thinking that their military and all militaries, India's military is as professional as Pakistan's military is. So, like, they have more resources, they are bigger. So they were thinking about exploiting that space below Pakistan's perceived strategic threshold. We had been voicing this concern to all the external observers that India probably is contemplating such a doctrine under the nuclear threshold. But many of India's allies and friends in India itself rejected that argument. And then we saw what happened in 2019. So that was the manifestation. The cold start didn't work. The proactive operation strategy didn't work. So they came up with the surgical strikes. Now there's a dilemma for a nuclear weapon state, because contrary to the perception that was created about Pakistan, that in India-Pakistan crisis, at the very start, Pakistan would contemplate the use of nuclear weapons. I think that perception has been debunked, because nuclear weapon states, they don't deal this way. They always keep their cards open, their options open. And between India and Pakistan, the escalation that you mentioned, I have always said that 44-rung escalation ladder, that is not going to work between India and Pakistan. The kind of animosity, distrust, and is there between the two countries. So 2019 was, I think, reflection of that. And we need to learn a lesson from 2019, that whatever we have learned during the Cold War period, or in terms of nuclear strategy, in some of the dyads, not everything goes as we think, or as we study, or as we plan. So there could always be variables, and that is why we always say that nuclear brinkmanship is a dangerous game, and we should be very, very careful. That's what I'm saying. But since you said that you try to trigger, and you try to, I just wanted to comment on some of the things that Manpreet said, and if you allow, Manpreet, academically, theoretically, and I think I trust what she believes. But look at from the adversary's perspective. If India is building canisterized delivery systems. And the senior leadership, they say that we are developing these systems to reduce the time. And the statements about no first use was not about some people like me, some academics saying those. These came from the sitting defense ministers. Manohar Parrikar, he was defense minister at that time, and he was part of the Nuclear Command Authority, and then the current defense minister. So if signaling comes from such high-ranking people from the Indian side as an adversary from a Pakistani perspective, you have to take those signals seriously, and you have to take actions or remedial actions. Not only these statements, and there were others also, like Shiv Shankar Menon in his book also wrote about it, and General Bagal, who was former commander of the strategic force, he also commented on that, of course, after retirement. But they are all very responsible people commenting on that. And from if you see from an adversary's perspective, you cannot just dismiss that these are just loose talk or they are their personal opinion. Defense minister doesn't have a personal opinion. And then you come on the capabilities itself. Several of the short-range missiles that India is building, on several occasions, these have been declared as dual use. India continues to reject, but these are tactical nuclear weapons. Again, India says we are not building tactical nuclear weapons, but Press Information Bureau in its official press release says the missile Prithvi is capable that's another missile. I'll just recall the name. That it is capable of carrying dual warheads. So dual warheads means conventional or nuclear, and likewise now MIRVed. Now, yes, as per doctrine, as per your understanding, you might say that India is not changing its posture, but having that MIRVed capable missile delivery systems, these are for counterforce targeting. And the kind of debate that is happening between India and Pakistan, many in Pakistan perceive that probably India might use these MIRV missiles against Pakistan's tactical nuclear weapons if Pakistan decides to deploy those. Okay. So those are the statements and the capabilities together. So Pakistani perspective comes from in that backdrop.
Which is why I think it's crucial to have some kind of mechanism in and through which the two sides can talk to each other, even if the tone and tenor of the overall relationship is not ideal. There are certain issues that still need to be handled with care. And I will get to Manpreet and get her response to what has been said. But I will pull in Matt as an external analyst, and it's like the external examiner on a thesis. So Matt, give me a sense, because like Manpreet talked about a sense of responsibility, and I can tell you that that particular incident in which we tracked a flying object which came and then turned sharply and entered Pakistani airspace, I think Pakistan played it in a very mature fashion, and I must say that the Indian analysts also acknowledge that. I think India is not entirely, coming clean on what happened for whatever reason, for security reasons, for reasons of the parameters of the missile and all that. But they've had a court of inquiry, and then one of the officers who was dismissed went to the Delhi High Court, and then, there was. So anyway, I want to get your sense on what has been said so far by Manpreet and then Adil. And then I'll go back to Manpreet to get her.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. And I'll keep my thoughts short because I'd love to hear Manpreet's response. Yeah, a lot of what has been said were things, that were, I guess, when we look at both India and Pakistan in terms of how their arsenals are changing, these are countries that are very, very difficult to analyze for a lot of the reasons that we've spoken about already in terms of transparency and things like that. But one thing that's very clear is that both countries are increasingly interested in shortening the decision time that is needed for leaders to be able to make decisions in a nuclear crisis. I think that is a very natural thing to do. And I think
dangerous.
Exactly, right? Like it's something that we see not just in India and Pakistan, but also in many other parts of the world, right? We are wanting to make nuclear systems able to launch very, very quickly, thus giving decision makers more time to make decisions in a crisis. But the flip side of that is that you are able to launch very, very quickly, and thus you can potentially bias towards launch. And there's a lot of studies that have been done to indicate that when you have systems that are, both first strike weapons and also would be targets of a first strike, such as MIRV systems, that there is a strong bias on the part of a decision maker to want to launch them very quickly.
Especially if you also have deployed, or you seem to have deployed, ballistic and cruise missile defense systems.
Yeah. Absolutely, right. And I can understand that desire, at least when I think about the doctrines and the respective policies. I understand that very much from the Pakistani perspective, because as I think has been pointed out, the doctrines are very different, right? And it is on the onus is on Pakistan to escalate in a crisis because there is a potential conventional inferiority, in that context. I understand it less from the Indian perspective, and so I other than just seeing it as a general trend that we're seeing around the globe, which is that countries want their military systems to be able to launch very quickly. So
but India's logic on that is, and this is actually becoming a major problem bilaterally between India and Pakistan, because if Pakistan says we need to do X, India says I can't do X because of China. So there's this whole thing about Southern Asia and a strategic chain problem, which is impacting the bilateral issues. And I was reminded when you talked about lessening the time, but Zian making, I was reminded of Yes Minister's "Where's the nuclear button?" where it says you got 12 minutes, Prime Minister, you got 12 minutes to decide this. But and of course, if you ultimately also put AI into the kill chain, where it's not sequential but simultaneous, and given the fact that already flight times between India and Pakistan are very little, you're talking about basically seconds, or maybe a couple of minutes, or 3 minutes, or 5 minutes maybe, and that's really, really unstable. But Manpreet, over to you.
Thank you very much, and I will have a few points to sort of bring up.
Sure.
Firstly, you speak about nuclear stability at the highest level, leading to conventional instability. I would go a step further and say it's actually subconventional instability, which is causing that, or nuclear stability is allowing that subconventional instability then to continue. And that's India's perception, which is pretty much, I think, accepted also by the world today, that you are able to do that subconventional provocations essentially by providing a shield with nuclear weapons for yourself. So that's a concern that India has. You mentioned that the opening round, India will win and it'll draw blood, but the blood would already have been sort of bled because of the subconventional act that has taken place. So that's really the starting point than the Indian response, which normally tends to be taken as the starting point for getting onto the escalation ladder. So
just an intervention without prejudice to what you're saying, and I perfectly understand what you're saying. The problem is that there are a number of attacks that the Indian government, even as the attack was happening, were attributed to Pakistan. And a number of Indian analysts and subsequent investigative reports have raised questions, for instance, about Pulwama. Frontline did an entire issue on that, raised multiple questions that that almost go up to the accusation of a false flag, or at least using something for political purposes, even as the intelligence agencies knew that an attack was imminent. So what I'm saying is, again, without prejudice to what you're saying, is that this is something that needs to be, one has to take with a pinch of salt.
Sure, just as there is a frontline report on it, there is also an official dossier which shows you something else. So we don't know. We are all outside.
Pakistan,
we are all outside the system.
Pakistan has 3 official dossiers on
Let's not go there because we don't know
what Pakistan considers India is doing in Balochistan. Recently, the foreign secretary came up with an entire, and we've done investigations about how some of the Indian agents were actually contracting people and killing Kashmiris inside Pakistan, which seems to us and to the world, and the Washington Post also reported this, in line with what India has been accused of elsewhere in the United States, in Canada, and elsewhere. So all I'm saying is that there seems to be, under this particular dispensation, a more muscular approach to foreign policy, where the muscle begins to sort of strengthen foreign policy, rather than, for instance, I can give you an example, like, for instance, from Mr. Vajpayee's days, a completely different approach to things.
I won't put that only to the administration or the government of today. It is also the tolerance levels of the general public and the mood globally, which seems to be favoring the use of force more than it used to in the past. So a lot of things come together when you are in a situation like this. But the point I want to make is that, conventional war in nuclear shadow. Matt started by saying that people know that they have nuclear weapons. Why do countries signal? That, like you were talking about Russia having to remind people that they have nuclear weapons, just as we've seen Pakistan reminding the international community and India that they have nuclear weapons when you get into the possibility of a conventional crisis. So what is being attempted is contouring the shape of the conventional conflict. As we've seen, the US has not gone beyond the point in its support for Ukraine. A lot more could have been given to Ukraine, but the presence of nuclear weapons has stopped
and also
that.
because of the ranges that don't strike Russia on Russian
mainland. Absolutely. So similarly, the Pakistani reminder of nuclear weapons tends to shape the contour of the conflict for India, and therefore the calibrated use of force. You've mentioned surgical strikes and the air strikes. These are all instruments that India is using, very much conscious of the fact that escalation at the conventional level has possibilities of escalation to the nuclear level. So you're using the minimum possible use of force to punish, but yet try to arrest escalation. I agree, things can go out of hand. Fortunately, both sides, after the initial sort of reaction to each other, have stopped where they have. Will that happen every time? One doesn't know. And therefore, as you're suggesting, some communication channels which are insulated from the level of political relationship are extremely important to be able to handle these situations. One point about canisterization. Canisterization is not necessarily only to reduce the time for launch. Canisterization is also to protect the missile from dust, from debris, from and for better mobility, especially with the kind of road mobile, rail mobile missiles that are being spoken about. So some of the assumptions that we make when you see a capability being developed on the other side, again, dialogue is necessary.
If you use canisterization also when you're mating the warhead with the delivery system.
Yeah, but there are several other layers which still go before you would actually fire that. So there are PALs and there are several.
Correct. I agree with you. You got permissive action links and the rest of it. But for instance, so there is obviously a discrepancy here between what India is doing and what others are perceiving, both in Pakistan and also how Matt is perceiving it as one of the co-authors. But when India says that Arihant is on a deterrence patrol, what should we understand from that? What is a deterrence patrol? is it just simply an SSBN going around, or is this SSBN has, something which obviously is a strategic deterrent? How should we proceed?
Certainly, when it's announced as a deterrent patrol, it's obviously going with the warheads on it. So that I don't think there's anything to be read otherwise into it.
You've got a confirmation there, because your report says that you are not. It's not confirmed whether it was. So now you've got a confirmation. Right.
A good data point.
And my last point is about this thing about defense minister having said that, we are going to change. Well, this defense minister was a sitting defense minister. The current defense minister is a sitting defense minister, as you say, part of the National Command Authority. Why hasn't the doctrine changed? These are statements that are made for various particular reasons, mostly political. Even when you mention, Shiv Shankar Menon, he was the National Security Advisor. General Nagal was CNC of the Strategic Forces Command. They were all in positions where they could have changed the doctrine if they wanted to. Why did it not happen that the doctrine did not change?
Warsaw Pact they did not have a declaratory first use policy, unlike NATO. And the late Therese Delpech, the French expert on nuclear weapons, she wrote very clearly that when the Berlin Wall came down and they had access to Warsaw Pact operational documents, they're surprised to see that the actual operational plans called for early and first use of tactical nuclear weapons against a NATO attack. So all I'm saying is that, as the late Sir Michael Quinlan used to say, no first uses for the birds. So it's the verifiable, or whether it's verifiable, that's the problem, especially when certain other things are happening. But very quickly,
if the adversary is not believing no first use, whether India says it or it removes it, does it matter? Because
no, what I'm saying is that Libyan gave 4 parameters for verifiable no first use, right?
Yeah.
And I did a program some weeks ago with one of the Chinese experts, and he said very clearly, because China itself is moving from launch after attack to a more aggressive posture, because they believe that with the ISR capabilities that the Americans have, they're likely to take out the Chinese nuclear arsenal. So one of the reasons they are increasing numbers, quantity, including quality, is because of that. That's what he said to me, and he's written a book on that. So my point is that there's certain perceptions and certain movements on the basis of which is why I'm again saying that during Cold War, when there was not much communication between the United States and the Soviet Union, Pugwash actually emerged as a platform where people could whisper into each other's ears and say things that they could not publicly say. And that sort of, stabilized certain situations. So I believe that surely you, as well as Adil, would agree with me that India and Pakistan need to have some kind of mechanism in and through which they can signal to each other, because the hotlines don't seem to work.
Yeah, certainly. Crisis communication, I think, is an area in which much improvement is needed between India and Pakistan. The problem comes when we start clubbing too many things under the same. So that's why I said you have to.
I'm focusing on the nuclear thing.
Absolutely.
Like, for instance, after this accidental launch, Pakistan had actually said that we want to be part of this inquiry. Right? India rejected that. So, for whatever reason, they didn't want Pakistan to get to the specifications of the missile and the rest of it, and I understand that. But what I'm saying is that at some point, some system needs to be in place, and so that now India acknowledged that this missile went into Pakistan after Pakistan had done the pressers and said that this has happened. So at the time of the launch, there was no system, or India did not deem fit to inform Pakistan that, hey, folks, don't start shooting at us because one of the things is, just gone wonky and is likely to come and hit you. That didn't happen. So I think something like that needs to happen.
Much lessons have been derived from this, but I also want to highlight, since you're saying that you want to focus on nuclear, India has made the segregation of its conventional and nuclear extremely transparent. And therefore, the BrahMos missile, which was a conventional missile, it was well known that a cruise missile, India does not arm with nuclear weapons. That, the dual use dimension, which is coming in many countries, that entanglement is actually creating more instability. So I completely go with you on how the matter should have been handled. I think lessons have been learned on what should have actually taken place. But the fact that India has this segregation of conventional and nuclear is also something which should be brought equally into the picture to show a certain responsibility in how it's maintaining its forces.
Okay. Adil, very quickly, couple of minutes, because I need to close the program also, and I want to circle back to Matt for his final intervention.
Okay. Ejaz, one thing is, you rightly said, we need to have a mechanism to talk to each other. Even if we are not ready to resolve the political disputes, we are both nuclear weapon states, and none of the two states wants to have a nuclear war, or any war which can escalate to a nuclear war. My personal understanding is, once we talk or meet our colleagues from India, and likewise they might be having different perception, there are lots of misperceptions about each other's nuclear postures. Whether that's deliberate, or we don't want to understand, or maybe it's a lack of understanding. Just again, we can go and to and fro and give our perspective. But Manpreet, you're right, absolutely. You might be saying, but once the DRDO chief says that they are canisterizing the missiles because the Prime Minister has told them to reduce the time from few hours to few minutes. Now again, the DRDO chief may be playing politics, but look at from the adversary's perspective. We see that headline, and Pakistan's decision maker, they have to take that into consideration. So that is one issue. Ejaz, with your permission, I want to go back to the Matt's wonderful report, but there are some issues that I would also want to highlight. The opening statements that the reasons why there's lack of interest on arms control. There's another interesting report by International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. So one of the factors is that in 2023, United States, the companies that are developing U.S. nuclear arsenal, they were being paid $31 billion in just 1 year. And there is an outstanding amount for $335 billion that the United States government has to pay to these contractors who are developing U.S. nuclear arsenal. Now, this is a big interest group that we have to take into consideration. What Matt was saying, the numbers might be going down, but the advancement in the weaponry is going up because there's these stakeholders, these interest group, the nuclear industrial complex, they are benefiting from it. The second point that I would want to make is about this debate on emerging technologies and its interface with nuclear weapons. Now, that has consumed much of energy of the think tanks. We see lots of debate issues about how nuclear deterrence is going to be in the future if the nuclear command control has artificial intelligence. I think that has also reduced that focus of that we need to focus on nuclear weapons use. The other things are complementary or whatever it is. So they are also blurring this debate. Third important point, I'm very happy this time that India finally overtook Pakistan. From the last 10, 15 years, Matt, that I had been reading these reports, Pakistan was always 5 weapons ahead. So this time, India has 172 and Pakistan has 170. Again, not questioning but congratulations for India. Reason is, Pakistan would no longer be accused of having a fastest developing nuclear weapons program. We were always pinned against the wall that probably we are developing nuclear weapons at a very faster rate. Nobody recognized that India was always 5 weapons below us. So if we were fastest developing, so India was also doing it. Now India has a lead, so we can claim that. Another important point is about this fissile material. Once India-US nuclear deal was being negotiated and it was formalized in 2008, under Hyde Act, US government administration had the obligation that if India's nuclear weapons grow because of this India-US nuclear deal, the president has to notify to the Congress. Some years back, I asked somebody in Washington, is somebody monitoring? Because we hear lots of stories about India's fissile facilities being built up, new facilities, and India has more number of facilities than it had in 2008. The answer was nobody is interested, nobody is asking. But now this stats that India has more fissile material and more weapons. I don't know if somebody would be interested. And finally, a reference to International Panel for Fissile Material report that also comes annually, like SIPRI report or ICANN report, which has been coming out for last 5 years. If you again see the plutonium stocks, the unsafeguarded plutonium stocks, the HU, and all these, India has much more potential than what it has been depicted as per the report, that 172 weapons. Again, India might have justification that they are doing it for their fast breeder reactor or the nuclear submarines. But you have to see India took a start in 50s and 60s, and it has been consistently building plutonium stocks, and then it started HU also. But the debate was always about Pakistan, that Pakistan has the fastest growing nuclear program, and hence the focus in Geneva also about the fissile material cutoff treaty. I think your report would now change, and we need to change this narrative also, that Pakistan doesn't have a fastest growing nuclear program anymore. Thank you.
Okay. Matt, final word to you quickly.
China has the fastest growing now.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm happy to say it is neither India nor Pakistan. It's certainly China is the fastest growing arsenal in the world, and perhaps even North Korea not far behind, right? So maybe a distant third. But I just want to also put in just some caveats as well with regards to the numbers, right? The numbers that we're able to derive, right, come with a lot of uncertainty with regards to India and Pakistan in particular, right? So,
the report mentions it very clearly.
Yeah. And
especially the tables, it says that these are all approximations, and
absolutely. And so we weigh different factors with regards to trying to come up with a final estimate, right? And so you end up with, when you go by the methodology that we have, right, a lot of what we're doing is looking at force structure with the assumption that countries are not going to build significantly more warheads than they can actually deploy on the ground, right? So everything is made up of assumptions, and assumptions can change, right? And so when we're looking at the 5 weapons behind or 2 weapons ahead, I want to just put in a very large caveat that this comes with a lot of uncertainty, and we have our methodology for why we get to those results, but I would not be surprised at all if the actual numbers were different, right? So we're doing the best with the information that we have available, but certainly, I would love if both countries were significantly more transparent about their arsenals, and then I could be out of a job.
Right.
Matt, Ejaz, if you just give me 1 second to say, Matt, sure. I really commend the work that you do. But as you said, I mean, it's not about the numbers; it's about the trends that you are seeing, which are happening. Yes. And for that, the work that you do is really worthwhile.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I always want to emphasize that the numbers are there because we have to put numbers to something, right? That's what we do, and that's what we're tasked to do. But the real interesting details are the trends, how countries are changing, and those are the details that are worth paying attention to.
Anyway, Matt wasn't particularly sure writing the report about deterrence patrol, so now there's a confirmation. I shall take credit for that. But this was a fabulous discussion, really, insightful. Thank you so much, Dr. Manpreet Sethi. Thank you, Matt Korda. Thank you, Dr. Adil Sultan. That's it from this episode. If you like the discussion, give the program a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. It doesn't get me any lucre, frankly, but would certainly make me very happy. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.